Have you ever wondered who actually runs the systems you take for granted every single day? The invisible engines that move money, power, data, and goods around the world, and why you've never heard their name? What if I told you the richest, most quietly powerful family on earth doesn't crave headlines, doesn't pose for magazine covers, and hasn't posted a single selfie? Yet their fingerprints are on the plumbing of modern civilization, the pipelines, the data centers, the shipping routes, the settlement systems that keep our economies breathing? You bought products they touched. You've used services they quietly enabled. You've benefited from rules and systems they helped design without ever knowing it. Tonight, we're not chasing the familiar billionaires you've seen 100 times. We're pulling back the curtain on a dynasty that built an empire the hard way, not by flaunting wealth, but by sewing itself into the infrastructure of the planet. Stay quiet, stay close. Because the real twist, how they turned silence into dominance and secrecy into a permanent seat at the global table, is the part most people still don't believe when they hear it. Before we step into their empire, before we follow the trail of influence, before we uncover how a single quiet dynasty threaded itself through the machinery of modern civilization, there's something you need to understand. Power, real power, is almost never loud. The loud ones make headlines. They chase cameras, sign book deals, appear on talk shows, and plaster their names across towers and stadiums. But the ones who shape the world, they move differently. They operate in silence. They master the shadows. They don't need recognition because they already own the stage everyone else is performing on. The family you're about to meet never depended on fame. They didn't rally crowds, break into politics, or build their empire with viral headlines. Instead, they built slowly, cleverly, invisibly, locking themselves into the systems that run everything, the banks that settle global transactions, the companies that move your data, the networks that ship your goods, the infrastructure nobody questions yet everyone depends on. You've lived your entire life inside a world they quietly shaped, and chances are no one ever told you their name. But that's the brilliance of their strategy, because the greatest form of control is the kind nobody notices. So as we move into this story, into their rise, their methods, their reach, understand one thing: this isn't the tale of people chasing power. It's the story of people who built the systems that generate power. And by the time we're done, you'll see why the wealthiest family you've never heard of might be the most influential one on earth. To understand the rise of this hidden dynasty, you have to travel back to a time when the world looked very different from today. No skyscrapers piercing the clouds, no digital markets humming in the background, no global networks connecting continents with the tap of a finger. The world was slower, louder, and far more chaotic. Empires rose and fell like waves. Markets crashed and rebuilt themselves in unpredictable cycles. Most wealth lived in land, gold, and old political power, all fragile, all vulnerable, all exposed. But somewhere in this noisy, uncertain era, a single family began working with an idea far bigger than themselves. An idea so simple and so brilliant that it would eventually reshape the very skeleton of modern civilization. If you want to control the world, don't chase what people see. Control what they need. They didn't build palaces. They built supply lines. They didn't focus on land. They focused on systems. And while other families fought each other for territory, titles, and thrones, this family studied the invisible machinery of society, the parts that no one noticed but everyone relied on. It began modestly: a transport route here, a warehouse there, a tiny financial service offered to local merchants who needed stability in a world that rarely offered any. But these small moves weren't random. Each one was a chess piece, each step a calculated advance, each investment a quiet thread woven into a larger web. They figured out how to be indispensable. While kings worried about borders and wealthy families clung to their fortunes, this dynasty invested in the arteries that kept economies alive: trade routes, messaging networks, shipping hubs, settlement systems, logistics pathways that would later become the backbone of global commerce. Every crisis that shook other families only strengthened them. Every market crash made their services more essential. Every political conflict increased the value of their neutrality. And slowly, almost invisibly, the world became dependent on them. Countries leaned on their infrastructure. Corporations relied on their systems. Governments used their logistics. Banks trusted their networks. The family didn't just grow wealth, they grew influence, the kind that doesn't show up on Forbes lists, the kind that doesn't require public recognition, the kind that moves quietly behind curtains and inside conference rooms where the real decisions are made. By the time the modern age arrived, by the time skyscrapers stretched upward and economies sprawled across continents, this dynasty was no longer part of the world's machinery. They were the machinery. And the strangest part, almost no one outside the inner circles even knew they existed. Their empire didn't rise with noise. It rose through necessity. It expanded through systems. It survived by being essential, not visible. And now, as we pull back the layers of history, we begin to see how a family that never asked for attention managed to build a quiet throne in the heart of the global economy. Their story is not about luck, it's about strategy, it's about vision. It's about mastering the invisible world long before anyone realized that the invisible world had all the power. As the world marched toward modernity, something remarkable happened. Not in front of cameras, not through revolutions or grand speeches, but in the quiet corridors where systems were born. While other families were busy chasing glory, grabbing land, or building monuments to their wealth, this dynasty focused on something far more valuable: the gaps, the blind spots, the overlooked inefficiencies, the fragile seams holding civilization together. Where others saw inconvenience, they saw opportunity. Where others saw disorder, they saw potential. And slowly, deliberately, they began inserting themselves into the very places where society struggled to stay organized. Mail systems were unreliable, they built distribution hubs. Settlements between merchants took weeks, they created faster channels. Trade routes were dangerous and disorganized, they established secure pathways. Governments needed a stable, neutral middleman to keep commerce flowing during conflict. They quietly stepped in. They weren't trying to control nations, they were trying to control the infrastructure that nations depended on. And it worked. Piece by piece, transaction by transaction, contract by contract, their influence expanded like a hidden network of roots beneath a growing tree. People didn't notice the roots, they only saw the branches. But the branches survived because of what lay unseen below. By now, the family had learned another secret, one that turned their growing advantage into something unstoppable. Power isn't just about what you own, it's about what people can't function without. And soon, governments, corporations, and entire industries found themselves depending on this family's systems in ways they never anticipated. A war might halt a border, but their supply lines kept goods moving. A financial crisis might shake economies, but their clearing channels kept transactions alive. A communications breakdown might cripple countries, but their networks stayed reliable. They were everywhere and nowhere. Their name wasn't on billboards. Their faces weren't on magazine covers. They didn't seek fame because fame creates scrutiny, and scrutiny disrupts control. Instead, they mastered something far more effective: strategic invisibility. That invisibility allowed them to do what no king, no president, no corporation could ever do without attracting resistance. They embedded themselves at the foundation of global stability. If a nation fell, their systems remained. If an economy crashed, their mechanisms endured. If governments changed overnight, their services stayed indispensable. And as the world became more connected, their reach grew exponentially. Trade became global. Banking became digital. Logistics became international. For most families, globalization was an opportunity. For this family, it was fuel. Every new trade agreement expanded their footprint. Every financial innovation strengthened their grip. Every international crisis amplified their necessity. They didn't just adapt to the new world, they helped build it. And the deeper they wove themselves into global systems, the less anyone could imagine those systems functioning without them. By the time the 21st century arrived, their empire was no longer simply influential. It was foundational, a hidden architecture supporting the visible world, a system so deeply embedded that removing them would be like pulling oxygen from the air or electricity from the grid. They weren't the richest because they flaunted wealth. They weren't powerful because they demanded it. They became powerful because the world ran smoother when they stayed silent. And that silence, that strategic, carefully cultivated silence, is what made them untouchable. As the world stepped deeper into the digital age, the family faced a crossroads, the kind that destroys dynasties that cling too tightly to the past. But this family, they didn't cling, they adapted. And with every major shift in global structure, financial, political, technological, they found new openings, new leverage, new ways to weave themselves into the unseen gears of civilization. They had already mastered logistics. They had already built the pathways that moved goods, letters, and settlements. But now, the world was changing faster than anything humanity had experienced before. Information wasn't just power, it was the new currency. And the family knew that controlling information wasn't about controlling newspapers or television or even political campaigns. It was about controlling the channels through which information quietly moves. Data routes, digital infrastructure, financial clearing systems, networks that decide what gets processed, what gets delayed, and what gets prioritized. The family understood something profound. Long before the rest of the world caught up, it's not the message that matters, it's the pipeline. Whoever owns the pipeline owns the flow of the modern world. And so they shifted, not loudly, not boldly, but with the same patient precision that had built their empire in the first place. They invested in global fiber networks that carried trillions of dollars worth of data every day. They partnered with banks and governments to develop secure digital settlement systems. They funded early tech infrastructure that would later become essential to international markets. While the world obsessed over Silicon Valley startups and billionaire tech founders posing for magazine covers, this dynasty expanded quietly in the background, building the highways those companies would use to grow. They weren't chasing the spotlight. They were building the stage. And the deeper they stepped into these systems, the more they realized a truth that would shape the next chapter of their rise. It wasn't enough to build the infrastructure. They needed to guide the rules that governed it, not control governments. That was messy, visible, unstable. No, they aimed for something far more subtle: influence the regulators, the committees. The obscure institutions most people never think about yet depend on every single day. These were the places where decisions weren't shouted, they were whispered, where the language wasn't emotional, it was technical, where the stakes weren't political, they were structural. A single update to a settlement rule could shift billions. A minor change to an international standard could reroute global markets. A new requirement for digital security could create demand for their systems and eliminate weaker competitors overnight. And because they already owned the infrastructure, they didn't need to manipulate outcomes. They simply had to offer expertise. Corporations leaned on their technology. International organizations invited them into the room because they were the ones who understood how the world actually functioned behind the curtain. And eventually, something extraordinary happened. Something that no king, president, or CEO could ever claim. The family became so foundational, so indispensable to the global ecosystem that their influence stopped needing permission. Doors opened for them automatically. Rules bent toward the systems they supported. Markets evolved around the infrastructures they owned. Entire industries adjusted themselves to align with the pipelines they had built decades earlier. Their power no longer came from wealth, but from integration. They didn't stand above the world. They were stitched into it. If they disappeared, entire economies would stutter. Trade would slow. Financial systems would glitch. Corporations would scramble. Governments would panic. The dynasty had achieved what few in history ever could. They made themselves irreplaceable, and they did it so quietly, so seamlessly, so invisibly that the world never stopped to ask how a family with no public profile ended up influencing the very rules that govern modern civilization. But the truth was simple. They understood that real power is not about stepping into the spotlight. It's about becoming the stage everyone else stands on. As their influence deepened, the world unknowingly entered a new chapter, a chapter where crises no longer happened around this dynasty. They happened through them. It didn't matter whether the crisis was financial, political, technological, or even biological. Every global shock sent people scrambling for stability. And when stability was needed, who did the world turn to? The ones who had built the systems that never failed. Quietly, almost elegantly, the family transcended the limits of ordinary power. They no longer reacted to world events. The world reacted to them. And that's when the shadows around their empire grew darker. Because once you become essential, you become a target and a shield at the same time. During the first major global financial meltdown of the modern age, governments panicked as markets spiraled. Banks fell like dominoes. Currencies shook. Stock exchanges crashed. Behind the chaos, thousands of institutions turned to one entity to settle trades, clear transactions, move shipments, and keep the arteries of commerce from collapsing. That entity was them. They didn't save the world out of charity. They saved it because the world had no choice. If their infrastructure went down, everything else would follow. Suddenly, they were no longer just a family. They were a lifeline. And governments, even the most powerful ones, began treating them differently. Phone calls weren't demands, they were requests. Investigations never went too deep. Regulations seemed to bend just enough to keep their systems stable. Meetings involving them always happened behind closed doors, with no cameras, no transcripts, no leaks. But the truly chilling part was how invisible this influence looked from the outside. People saw banks, they saw politicians, they saw the chaos in markets. But they never saw the quiet coordination happening underneath. The dynasty redirecting flows of money, rebalancing global trade routes, making decisions in seconds that determine the fate of millions. And they did it all without ever appearing in a headline. Over the years, crisis after crisis came and went. Each time, the pattern repeated. The world shook, systems strained, governments scrambled. And in the background, the family's networks hummed with calm, mechanical precision, keeping supply chains from freezing, keeping transactions from failing, keeping data flowing across borders, keeping nations breathing. Their reputation within elite circles transformed. They weren't just reliable, they were untouchable. The more the world relied on them, the more they embedded themselves deeper into international infrastructure. And they discovered something extraordinary. Crises didn't weaken them. Crises strengthened them. Every disaster created new demand for their expertise. Every breakdown forced institutions to adopt the family systems. Every disruption taught governments the same lesson. You don't survive the next shock unless you stay close to the people who survived the last one. Step by step, year by year, system by system, they stitched themselves so tightly into the fabric of global stability that removing them became impossible. But that level of influence comes with a price. Because when you operate in the shadows, control is never guaranteed. Rivals emerge. Observers ask questions. Whispers begin to spread. Who are they? How far does their influence reach? How can one family build a machine so vast that even world powers depend on it? And those questions, those suspicions, those faint outlines of discomfort would eventually create a storm of their own. A storm that threatened to expose the dynasty's long-cultivated invisibility. But here is where their genius becomes undeniable. Instead of running from scrutiny, they adapted again, shifting from being invisible actors to being indispensable guardians of global order, a role no one elected them for, yet a role no one else was capable of playing. Their evolution wasn't complete. The next phase would take them from shadows into something far more complex, a quiet influence over decisions, policies, alliances, and the architecture of the world itself. And the line between stability and control was about to become impossible to separate. As their systems wrapped themselves around the world, the family entered a new era of influence, a kind of power so subtle, so deeply woven into global operations that it no longer needed to push, it only needed to lean, and the world moved. This is where their story becomes harder to trace, because the next stage of their ascent didn't happen through ownership or wealth or public authority. It happened through alignment. Slowly, the institutions that shape nations, regulators, central banks, multinational corporations, global councils, supply chain consortiums, all began adopting standards that quietly mirrored the family's systems. Not because they were pressured, not because they were coerced, but because those systems simply worked better than anything anyone else had built. Efficiency became a Trojan horse. And inside that efficiency, influence. When a country needed a faster settlement protocol, they turned to the family's methods. When a bank needed international compliance frameworks, they followed the family's templates. When a global corporation wanted secure data movement, they used the family's infrastructure. The more people adopted, the more the family's standards became the default, not by force, but by inevitability. That inevitability created something extraordinary. They were no longer fighting for influence. The world was adapting itself to them. Governments adjusted regulations because it made trade smoother. Corporations redesigned their internal systems to match the family's networks. International committees wrote rules that aligned with the family's technology. And with each alignment, a small piece of sovereignty shifted from public institutions to a private dynasty no one had ever voted for. Nothing illegal, nothing scandalous, nothing even noticeable to the average citizen, just alignment. And in that alignment, a new form of control emerged, one that didn't require ownership or political power. It required necessity. Once a country depends on a system, it is bound to the hands that maintain it. Once a corporation builds on a network, it cannot easily leave it. Dependency is the strongest form of control because it doesn't need to be enforced. It enforces itself. Soon, the family's reach extended into places their ancestors could only dream of: energy grids, port logistics, international shipping lanes, emergency supply infrastructures, digital authentication systems, interbank settlement channels, global compliance networks. They weren't controlling governments. Governments were simply following the paths the family had already paved. And because their work was technical, complex, and wrapped in jargon, the world barely noticed. People saw headlines about CEOs and political leaders, but never about the quiet dynasty in the background whose framework shaped those leaders' decisions. They didn't need to manipulate markets. Markets operated on their rails. They didn't need to command politicians. Politicians governed inside systems the family provided. They didn't need to pressure corporations. Corporations couldn't function without their infrastructure. This was the kind of power that didn't need to shout to be heard. It whispered, and entire industries adjusted. It suggested, and international bodies adopted. It hinted, and nations shifted policies to match. For the first time in modern history, a private quiet dynasty had managed to achieve what empires, monarchies, and superpowers had failed to secure. Not land, not armies, not political dominance, but the channels, the vital arteries of a world that couldn't run without them. And the most astonishing part, most people on Earth still had no idea the family existed. But the next chapter in their story would expose something even more shocking. With great stability comes the temptation to shape the future, not for profit, not for ego, but to maintain the world in a form that guarantees their throne remains unshaken. Because once you make yourself indispensable, the only threat left is change itself. Once a dynasty becomes indispensable, once the world depends on its systems the way a body depends on oxygen, a new kind of power emerges, a quiet ability not just to stabilize events, but to shape what comes next. By now, their influence was no longer confined to trade routes, logistics, or data channels. Their network had become an invisible operating system beneath the global economy. And when you hold the operating system, you don't have to rewrite the rules all at once. You only have to nudge the updates. That's when the dynasty entered its most strategic phase, not controlling the world, but guiding it. Their ancestors had built pathways, their successors strengthened them. And now, the modern generation realized something revolutionary. If you know what the world will need tomorrow, you can become the only one prepared to provide it. So they began studying trends not like analysts, but like architects of the future. They monitored demographic shifts. They tracked supply chain vulnerabilities. They analyzed resource scarcity decades ahead. They observed social behavior, digital adoption, global migration, environmental pressures, and geopolitical friction. They didn't read the news. They read patterns. And slowly, they moved ahead of the wave. When cities began to strain under population growth, the family increased investments in automated distribution hubs and last-mile logistics networks long before anyone else realized the demand was coming. When the digital revolution sparked cybersecurity threats that governments were unprepared for, they quietly funded the earliest teams that would eventually design global authentication systems used by corporations and institutions everywhere. When climate change threatened shipping lanes in farming regions, they shifted capital into cold chain logistics, water security networks, and resilient trade routes, anticipating crises before they erupted. Every step was precise, every move subtle, every investment disguised as necessity. And with each global shift, each pivot in technology, society, or politics, their grip deepened. But here is where the story takes its sharpest turn. Because as their predictive capabilities grew, as they saw further into the future than most nations, something unexpected began to happen. World leaders started seeking their guidance, not officially, not publicly, no cameras, no speeches, a quiet meeting in a neutral hotel, a private lunch after a conference, a back-channel call during a crisis. Politicians asked questions they would never admit they needed answers to. What vulnerabilities should we prepare for? How do we stabilize our supply chain? What systems are other nations adopting that we aren't? What risk will hit us next year or the next decade? And the family, ever careful, ever neutral, ever strategic, provided insights in measured doses, information that maintained balance without revealing how much they truly knew. Because their goal wasn't to rule the world. It was to protect the system they had built, the system the world now relied on. The more fragile global stability became, the more valuable their presence was. And the more valuable their presence became, the deeper their influence grew. This was no longer simply a dynasty, it was an ecosystem. A circulatory system for global commerce wrapped inside the anonymity of a family tree. Their ideas shaped trade agreements. Their predictions influenced regulatory frameworks. Their warnings determined diplomatic priorities. Their technology became the backbone of everything from currency flows to digital identity to emergency response systems. But there was a cost to seeing so far ahead. The family now understood that the next great threat wouldn't come from outside. It would come from a world evolving faster than even their systems could manage. Artificial intelligence, automation, cyber conflict, resource scarcity, population imbalance, and the collapse of old economic structures. The dynasty sensed the shift early, long before most governments did. They saw that the next age wouldn't be defined by nations or corporations or wealth. It would be defined by infrastructure, the battle to control the platforms that every other system depends on. If they wanted to maintain their throne, they would need to prepare for a world where even their invisible power could be challenged by new forces rising on the horizon. And that realization, that the game was about to change, pushed them into the boldest, most consequential era of their existence. An era where influence wasn't enough, where stability wasn't enough, where neutrality wasn't enough. Because the future was coming fast, and this dynasty had no intention of being left behind. For nearly a century, the dynasty operated in the shadows without fear. No rival understood their architecture. No competitor matched their depth. No government dared disrupt the systems they maintained. But the future has no loyalty to the past. And as the world accelerated into the digital age, a new threat emerged. Not from nations, not from corporations, and not from political shifts. The threat came from technologies capable of rebuilding the world on entirely new foundations. For the first time in generations, the dynasty sensed movement beneath their feet. The ground shifting, the old systems trembling, the future rushing forward with a speed their ancestors never had to confront. Artificial intelligence, blockchain networks, decentralized platforms, autonomous logistics, quantum computing, mass data migration, digital currencies that bypass traditional settlement systems altogether. These weren't just innovations, they were tectonic plates, and each one had the potential to break the family's carefully constructed web in ways no crisis ever could. The dynasty watched as new players emerged. Tech founders in their 20s, investors with unlimited liquidity, engineers building systems that didn't rely on the dynasty's infrastructure. The world they once stabilized was evolving into a world that might outgrow them. But the family didn't panic. They analyzed. They studied the newcomers like a surgeon studies a patient. They identified weak points, timelines, vulnerabilities, and eventual outcomes that even the innovators themselves couldn't see. And slowly, the dynasty began shifting again, not to compete head-on, but to weave themselves into the next generation of global infrastructure. They invested quietly in emerging technologies. They funded research teams under shell companies. They partnered with tech labs, not as owners, but as strategic collaborators. They weren't trying to dominate the new world. They were trying to anchor it. Because they understood something the new innovators didn't, a technology is powerful only when the world depends on it, and dependency takes time. So the family played the long game. While new platforms tried to disrupt global logistics, the dynasty built the digital rails underneath them. While decentralized finance sought to bypass traditional networks, the family quietly supplied the compliance, the identity verification, the fail-safes those platforms needed to survive. While AI systems tried to predict supply chain behavior, the family fed them the historical data sets that made the predictions possible. The innovators thought they were leading the revolution, but beneath the surface, it was the dynasty enabling it. Yet even with their adaptation, a deeper, more existential threat loomed. A world that once relied on human expertise was becoming increasingly automated, and automation doesn't respect dynasties. Machine intelligence can build new systems without historical bias. It can create optimized networks without needing old infrastructures. It can propose new models that challenge everything the family built. For the first time in their history, the dynasty saw a future where their power could fade, not because they failed, but because the world no longer needed what they had always provided. That realization shook the inner circle. Influence wasn't enough anymore. Adaptation wasn't enough. Even invisibility wasn't enough. They had entered a new age, one where the future would be shaped not by who controlled the old systems, but by who designed the next ones. And the dynasty understood something terrifying. They had no choice but to evolve faster than the world that was evolving around them. That meant new alliances, new strategies, new risks, and decisions more consequential than anything their ancestors had ever faced. The age of silent power was nearing its end. A new contest was beginning, one where the rules weren't written yet, and where their survival was no longer guaranteed. And in the shadows of this accelerating world, the family made a vow. If the future was shifting, they would shift faster. If the world was rewriting itself, they would learn the new language. If the next generation of power was being born, they would be in the room when the first breath was taken. The world was rewriting itself faster than any dynasty could comfortably adapt. But this family wasn't built on comfort. They were built on survival, and survival demanded a new kind of boldness. For the first time in generations, they understood that operating purely in the shadows was no longer enough. The world had entered an age where the invisible was becoming visible, where algorithms could expose patterns that once stayed buried, where data trails could reveal moves they used to make silently, where young innovators could disrupt industries with nothing more than code. In this new world, pure secrecy was a liability, so the family made a decision that would have horrified their ancestors. They stepped closer to the surface, not fully into the light, not into public fame or political power, but into a space where they could shape the future without being eclipsed by it. And it began with a single, calculated move. They created a front-facing innovation consortium, a harmless-sounding organization that governments and corporations believed was just another research initiative. But behind the polished logo and neutral statements, it was something far more strategic, a bridge, a place where the dynasty could observe and quietly influence the new power centers rising across the world. AI pioneers were invited under the pretext of collaboration. Blockchain architects joined to standardize frameworks. Data scientists contributed to global resilience studies. Tech giants sent representatives to ensure compliance with emerging systems. Every new idea that had the potential to disrupt global infrastructure passed through these rooms. And there, in glass-walled boardrooms overlooking cities that pulsed with digital life, the family began shaping the future from the inside, not by dominating the innovators, but by guiding them, offering data sets no one else had access to, providing risk analyses that predicted failures before anyone else saw them, funding early experiments under the guise of public benefit research, and subtly steering conversations toward systems that aligned with the dynasty's long-term survival. Meanwhile, their internal operations were undergoing an evolution of their own. The old logistics networks that had sustained global trade for a century were upgraded with machine-driven coordination. Predictive models replaced intuition. Quantum-secure channels replaced old data pipelines. Smart hubs replaced human dispatch. The dynasty wasn't resisting the future. They were absorbing it. But with each new adaptation, with each step they took into the emerging digital order, they realized something unsettling. New power was rising faster than ever before. This power had no loyalty, no tradition, no face. It existed in the form of decentralized systems that belonged to no one, artificial intelligence that answered to no dynasty, algorithms that didn't care about old influence, networks so widely distributed that no single family could ever hope to own them. And that was the first time in decades the dynasty felt the cold edge of vulnerability. Because you can negotiate with governments, you can advise corporations, you can partner with innovators, you can even outmaneuver competitors, but you cannot negotiate with a technology that speaks in code and evolves in microseconds. Their greatest fear wasn't losing wealth or losing power, it was losing relevance. But the dynasty did not break, they recalibrated. They realized that if they wanted to survive the next era, they needed to become more than infrastructure. They needed to become the connective tissue between old power and new. So they launched a series of moves that seemed harmless on the surface but carried tectonic implications underneath. They began advising governments on how to integrate AI into national security. They helped corporations manage automated supply chains that threatened to collapse under their own complexity. They partnered with tech labs to build hybrid systems that combined traditional logistics with machine learning. And slowly, subtly, they created a new kind of dependency, a dependency that didn't replace their old systems but merged with them. By positioning themselves as the only entity capable of bridging the gap between human-driven and algorithm-driven worlds, they secured a new kind of dominance, not total, not permanent, but essential, which was all they ever needed. Still, one final challenge waited ahead, a challenge far greater than technological disruption, economic upheaval, or political instability. A challenge that would force the dynasty to confront the ultimate question every empire eventually faces. What happens when the world you built no longer needs you to survive, but you still need the world to stay alive? That moment was coming, fast, and the family could feel it like a chill in the air. The next chapter would decide everything, their legacy, their survival, their place in a world that no longer respected history unless history could still deliver value. And the dynasty was preparing to make its most daring move yet. The winds of the new era blew harder than anything the dynasty had ever faced. The world was no longer changing in cycles, it was changing in leaps. And for the first time in generations, their carefully built foundation began to tremble. Not from enemies, not from rivals, but from the momentum of progress itself. A government announcing plans to nationalize certain digital infrastructure. An AI company proposing a new global standard that bypassed the dynasty's networks entirely. A young engineer publishing research that threatened to make some of their oldest systems obsolete overnight. Individually, none of these events seemed threatening, but together they formed a pattern. A pattern that said the future might not need them. And that realization ignited something primal inside the family. Not fear, but resolve. They had survived wars. They had survived market collapses. They had survived political cycles and technological revolutions. But this was different. This was the world evolving beyond their reach. And so the dynasty gathered, not in the grand halls of the past, but in a quiet, heavily secured estate overlooking a city glowing with the light of the digital age. The elders sat at one end of the long oak table, faces marked with the wisdom of decades. The younger generation, sharp, tech-savvy, impatient, sat at the other. Between them was the weight of history. Voices rose and fell. Old models were questioned. New ideas clashed. The past and the future collided in a room filled with tension so thick it felt like time itself held its breath. Some argued that they should preserve the legacy, protect the old systems, defend the networks built over a century, push back against new platforms threatening to replace them. But the youngest voice in the room said something no one expected. If we fight the future, we lose. If we shape it, we stay immortal. The room fell silent. He was right. The dynasty didn't survive by resisting change. They survived by anticipating change, by riding the tide instead of drowning beneath it. So they made the most daring decision in their history. a decision that would shock the world if the world ever learned about it. They would begin dismantling parts of their own empire, not to weaken themselves, but to evolve. Old systems would be retired before competitors could destroy them. New alliances would be forged with companies that didn't even exist a decade ago. Traditional supply chains would be replaced with autonomous ones, and the family would quietly step into the emerging frameworks governing AI, cybersecurity, digital identity, and the new global value networks forming in real time. It was the equivalent of a monarch voluntarily burning its own throne just to build a new one in the palace next door. And all of this happened behind curtains, in silence, without a single headline. After the meeting, as dawn spilled across the horizon, one of the elders stood at the window, watching the city pulse with new life. Below, millions moved through their daily routines unaware of the decisions being made above them, decisions that would shape the architecture of their future. For the first time, the elder felt something he had never felt before. The world was no longer theirs to guide. It was becoming something far more unpredictable, something decentralized, something borderless, something algorithmic. But he also knew this: the dynasty had one final strength left, the ability to weave themselves into any system the world created next. All they needed was to make one last move before the future locked into place, a move that would determine whether their influence lived on or faded into a historical footnote. And as the sun rose, as shadows dissolved into light, the family prepared to make that move. What they didn't know, what no dynasty can ever fully foresee, was that the world was about to test them in a way they never imagined. A test that would blur the line between influence and survival, between guidance and control, between relevance and extinction. And the final chapter of their story was about to begin. The test arrived without warning, not through a war, not through a financial collapse, not through political upheaval, but through a shift so quiet, so sudden, and so irreversible that even the dynasty, with all its foresight, felt the tremor. It began with a new global standard, a digital framework proposed by a coalition of nations and corporations designed to unify AI governance, data flow, and economic coordination. A framework powerful enough to redraw how the world organizes itself. A framework independent of the dynasty. For the first time in generations, the world was building something without them, not against them, not to weaken them, simply without them. This was the moment every great empire faces, the moment where history reveals whether power was built on necessity or on illusion. And so, in a private meeting that would never appear in records, the dynasty made the most consequential decision in its long-hidden existence. They agreed they would not fight the new system, they would become part of it. Not as rulers, not as architects, not as custodians of the old world, but as the silent interface between the world that was and the world that was coming. They offered their networks, their expertise, their historical data sets, their logistics infrastructures, their digital rails, their authentication models, their emergency coordination systems. And they did it not out of desperation, but out of strategy. Because they realized something profound: in a future shaped by AI, decentralization, and autonomous systems, power wouldn't belong to those who controlled the past, but to those who provided the pathways that kept the future stable. And stability was the dynasty's oldest talent. The world accepted their offer immediately. Of course it did. No nation, no corporation, no consortium on Earth could match the century of embedded infrastructure the dynasty had quietly built. And just like that, the family became part of the new global architecture, not at the top, not at the center, but exactly where they had always been strongest, everywhere important, and nowhere visible. People would never know. They would see headlines about new technologies, new systems, new global agreements. They would hear politicians speak of progress and CEOs speak of innovation. But beneath those headlines, beneath the speeches, beneath the launch events and televised ceremonies, the dynasty's fingerprints would remain, not as rulers, not as masters, not as a secret shadow government, but as the quiet framework that made the new world possible. They didn't win by dominating the future. They won by becoming essential to it. And in that quiet victory, they secured the one thing every dynasty seeks but almost none achieve: relevance beyond their era. As their final meeting concluded and the global transition entered full motion, the youngest heir of the family stepped outside into the cool night air. He looked up at the skyline, a skyline no longer ruled by monuments to old power, but by circuits, data, and a new kind of intelligence. He smiled. The dynasty would not be remembered in books. Their name would not echo in history classes. Number 2, instinct their numb. Children would not grow up hearing stories about them, but that was never the point. Their legacy was not in their name. It was in the systems that outlived them, systems that would move the world long after they were gone, quietly, invisibly, precisely, exactly how they always preferred it. And as the lights of the city flickered like stars below him, he whispered the truth the dynasty had always lived by: real power is never seen, only felt.